Hi. So I am back to the same format as the first two video lectures, back to my face, um, to talk about queer phenomenology, chapter 3, the Orient and other others. And in this video lecture, I'll mainly just be recapping what Ahmed says herself in the chapter, but just in a little bit more of a condensed way and in a different format. So if it's easier for you to watch or listen to this, that I'm offering it as another way into the chapter. So to get started, Ahmed takes us into the chapter through a quote from Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, which is sort of a post-colonial classic. And I'll just read the quote in its entirety because it's important to the chapter. And then the occasion arose when I had to meet the white man's eyes. An unfamiliar weight burdened me. The real world challenged my claims. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. Consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is third person consciousness. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to reach out my right arm and take the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. The matches, however, are in a drawer on the left, and I shall have to lean back slightly. And all these movements are made not out of habit, but out of implicit knowledge. Um, and so this is Ahmed's way in to this chapter. She writes where phenomenology attends to, and here she uses this list: tactile, vestibular, kinesthetic, and visual character of embodied reality. Um, Fanon asks us to think of the historic racial scheme, which is importantly below it or behind it, and that's going to be one of the big things in this chapter. Is that what is behind, what is below, what is obscured, what is the work that is obscured from view, and in this chapter, that work is largely the work of reproducing racial hierarchies. Um, so, Ahmed observes, for the black man, Fanon implies, we have to look beyond the surface. For Fanon, racism interrupts the corporeal schema, and the corporeal schema is the body at home. So already we have a different angle on phenomenology that comes from not from a sense of being situated at home in one's own body, but from a sense of being othered within one's own body. So Ahmed's goal here, she says it straight out: I want to consider racism as an ongoing and unfinished history, which orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space, following Fanon as well as the philosophers who have sought to offer a phenomenology of race. So that's the big theme for this chapter, is phenomenology of race. And she starts this with a critique of nominalism, in the sense that the claim has been made that race is an invented category, as if it were a property of bodies or groups. But for Ahmed, to enter into a phenomenology of race means acknowledging that it does not follow from such a critique that race does not exist. Phenomenology, and this is me quoting Ahmed, phenomenology helps us to show how race is an effect of racialization and to investigate how the invention of race, as if it were in bodies, shapes what bodies can do. And this basically, if you dig into it, it sums up a lot of the chapter, which is to say that race is not imagined as a static transcendental category that attaches to bodies, but rather it's the effect of ongoing work, and as we'll see later in the chapter, habit and habitus, and the work of creating and reproducing familiarity or family resemblances. So Ahmed lays out her plan, One, she wants to look at how proximity and distance come to be lived by association with specific bodies and places. Two, Ahmed wants to look at how whiteness is reproduced in domestic spaces, and then beyond that in public spaces and institutional spaces. Um, Three, she wants to describe the effects of racism on bodies that are not or not quite white. And she has a particular personally vested interest, and I think also a general interest in what considerations of what she calls mixed orientations can offer. Um, and then finally, she says, if we begin to consider what is affective about the unreachable, we might even begin the task of making race a rather queer matter. So this isn't as clear of an objective as some of the previous things I listed, but I do think that this is ultimately her end goal, and if she doesn't necessarily fully arrive there in this chapter, having that in mind, she's moving us towards something for the conclusion. So the first section in this chapter is called Orientalism and Phenomenal Space. Of course, since it's Ahmed, we get on page 112 more lexicographical and etymological thinking. I realized that I had just been calling this etymological thinking, and etymology, of course, is studying the origins of words, and lexicographical feels more apt in this sense. It's as my way of referring to the way that Ahmed enjoys riffing on the multiple definitions that vocabulary, in particular around spatiality, can have. On 113, Ahmed talks about how east as a simple direction point, as in east of here, becomes this transcendental category of the east through consideration of cartographic space via Lefebvre, who I will admit that I'm not super familiar with, but there's something interesting happening here about two-dimensionality and the space of the map, and the conceptual and theoretical implications that even entering into the two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space, what the implications of that are. But that's sort of an aside. 114, we arrive at sort of the classic text. Edward Said's Orientalism gets invoked to talk about how the Orient functions as the Occident's constitutive outside. The constitutive outside is just a fancy way of saying the thing which is not me, that nonetheless is necessary to recognize or create me or instate me as a other to it. I guess is my nutshell definition. Quote, the making of the Orient is an exercise of power. The Orient is made Oriental as a submission to the authority of the Occident. To become Oriental is both to be given an orientation and to be shaped by the orientation of that gift. And this, for me, is one of a couple times in this chapter that recalls this so-called gift of compulsory heterosexuality in chapter 2, which the recipient refuses at their own risk. And then there's a little bit more here on the Orient's notness and its farness, and also a recognition of the contribution of feminist post-colonial scholars who've shown how, in addition to being not or far, the Orient is also sexualized. And this is due to the fantasy of a lack or presumed lack, perceived lack within the West that turns desire towards the Orient as a supply point. So 115, desire involves a political economy in the sense that it is distributed. The desire to possess and to occupy constitutes others not only as objects of desire, but also as resources for world making. And this is where Ahmed introduces one of the main conceptual frameworks of this chapter, which is the idea of towardness and aroundness. So this is the first introduction we get to towardness. Towardness is a mode of directionality. It is about the direction I face when facing an other, as a direction that can refer to motion and position. She also talks about how othering doesn't simply negate, it also incorporates the other, the not me, into the body of the subject as an extension of its reach. 116, quote, to be orientated around something means to make that thing central, or as being at the center of one's being or action. In other words, to be orientated around something is to make that thing binding, or to constitute oneself as that thing. So to apply this to Orientalism, quote, the Occident coheres as that which we are organized around through the very direction of our gaze toward the Orient. And this is one of the most important points of this chapter, because this is a structure of perception that I believe that Ahmed recognizes as happening in an interpersonal embodied way, as well as in a sort of institutional way or geographic way, or even a hegemonic way. And it's a schema that might not necessarily be self-evident. You would think that, I guess this is just me trying to come at this, that you are directed, that if you are trying to define yourself as an area, you might direct your gaze inward. But in fact, it's this outward-looking gaze and the fact that a group of people or institutions are sharing that directedness out, that actually shapes them around a center. So this is a really important point. As Ahmed says, Said's model shows us that the Orient is both strange and familiar. 117, the Orient is brought home, but the act of bringing is what sustains the difference. And I personally, I liked that Ahmed pauses to ponder whether Husserl's table was Oriental, which brings to mind the piece that I sent by Marina Warner and HD on Freud's rugs, which is a topic that Ahmed herself introduces on page 149. So Ahmed talks about the reachable as a function of domestication and remarks on how groups are formed out of a shared direction. A we emerges as an effect of shared direction toward an object. And just to reiterate again, because it's really important, that the gaze of the we might be directed in a certain direction, but that shared direction means that the we is forming around its own center of gravity, not necessarily around the thing at which it's gazing. So Derrida makes an appearance again, enlisted by Ahmed to recall that archives are homes, ways of gathering material around which worlds gather. There's that stickiness again. If archives allow documents to dwell, then they too are orientation devices, which in gathering things around are not neutral but directive. So Orientalism is a form of world-facing, and Orientalism also involves phenomenal space. It is a matter of how bodies inhabit spaces through shared orientations. And then there's a little bit here from Freud on group formation through shared orientation. And the example I think that's given here is like the love of the leader. So this is a little bit of the third chapter, to be continued in another video. We'll pick up in the next video and talk about page 119 going forward.